set my hands flat on the table in front of me and focused on the grain of the wood. There was a long scratch running diagonally across the surface, like someone had dragged a key across it years ago and never thought to fix it. I remember thinking, whoever left that mark probably had no idea they'd be part of the background of the worst day of my life. My stepmother was 2 chairs down crying, not quietly, the kind of crying that fills a room, that makes people look, that makes you feel guilty even when you absolutely know that you have done nothing wrong. The judge hadn't said anything yet. He was reading. His glasses were halfway down his nose, and he kept turning pages slowly, methodically, like a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use it. My lawyer had submitted everything that morning. 43 pages. I knew the page count because I had assembled every single one of them myself. My stepmother's attorney leaned over and whispered something to her. She nodded and wiped her face with a tissue she'd been holding since we walked in. I kept looking at the scratch in the table. I had learned over the past 14 months that the most important thing I could do was appear calm, not because I was, but because every time I let my face do what I actually felt, someone in her orbit would take a photo, or write something down, or mention it later to someone who mattered. So I sat still, I breathed slowly, and I waited. My father died on a Tuesday in October. He had been sick for 2 years, but still, it was a Tuesday and I was at work, and my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be the hospital chaplain, which is the kind of detail you don't forget no matter how badly you want to. I was 28 years old. My mother had passed when I was 9. I had no siblings. And the only family I had left was a woman named Ruth Ann, who had married my father 6 years earlier, and who had, in those 6 years, rearranged nearly every corner of the life he and I had built together. I want to be fair. In the beginning, she wasn't cruel. She was just present, filling space, moving things. My dad's coffee mug that had been on the same shelf for 20 years ended up in the back of a cabinet. His reading chair was reupholstered without anyone asking. Small things. The kind of thing you tell yourself not to make a big deal about, because it's just a chair, because she's just trying to make the house feel like hers too, because your dad is happy and that's what matters. I told myself all of it. He had changed his estate plan when they got married. I knew that. He told me directly, sitting at the kitchen table, explaining that he'd set up a living trust, that the house and the bulk of his investments would be in joint names, but that he had a separate account, what he called your mother's money, that had been earmarked for me since I was 19, about $380,000. My mother's life insurance, plus what he'd grown it into over the years. He made me write down the account number. He made me take a photo of the trust document. He was very clear. When he died, that account had $12,000 in it. I found out about the money 3 weeks after the funeral. I was still sleeping in my childhood bedroom. I hadn't been able to make myself go back to my apartment. And I was going through the mail because Ruth Ann asked me to, because she said the paperwork was overwhelming her and she just needed a few days. I sorted. I stacked. I opened what looked like financial statements because that seemed like the kind of thing someone needed to be aware of. The account number matched the one I had photographed. The balance did not. I sat on the floor of my father's home office for a long time. I remember the carpet had a pattern of small diamonds, and I kept counting them because I didn't know what else to do. Eventually, I took the statement into the kitchen and put it on the table in front of Ruth Ann, who was drinking tea, and I said, "What happened to this account?" She looked at it. She looked at me, and then she said, with the most level voice I have ever heard from another human being, "Your father made some investment decisions in his last year that didn't go the way he hoped. I'm sorry, sweetheart. He didn't want to worry you." She reached out and touched my hand. I pulled it back. Something in me went very still, not sad, not angry, still. The way a room goes quiet right before something breaks. I am a forensic accountant. I have been one since I was 24 years old. I work mostly with litigation teams, attorneys who need someone to find money, trace money, or explain what happened to money in terms that a jury can understand. Ruth Ann did not know this about me. Or rather, she knew my job title. She did not understand what it meant. I didn't correct her understanding. I never had. People hear accountant and they imagine spreadsheets and tax returns. That's fine. I don't explain myself at parties. I've never had a reason to. I had a reason now. I went back to my apartment the following week. I called the bank directly, identified myself as a named beneficiary of the trust, and requested a full transaction history on the account. The trust documents gave me standing to do that. My father had made sure of it. The woman on the phone was cautious, then cooperative, then quiet in a way that told me she had looked at the records and understood what I was about to see. There were 61 transactions over 17 months, starting 8 months before my father died, when he was sick enough to need help, but not so sick that anyone would have questioned his signature, and ending 11 days after his funeral. The money had gone to 4 places. 2 of them were legitimate, medical expenses I could verify. 2 of them were not. One was a company called Hartwell Property Group LLC, registered in Nevada, with a registered agent address that turned out to be a mailbox rental store in a strip mall outside of Reno. The other was a personal account at a credit union in a town 2 hours away from where we lived. I requested those records too. It took me 4 months to get everything I needed. I didn't call Ruth Ann during that time. I didn't contact her attorney. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing except my own lawyer, a woman named, and I mention this only because she matters to the story, Beverly Okafor, who had been my colleague's recommendation and who turned out to be one of the sharpest people I have ever had in my corner. I documented everything: timestamps, account numbers, wire transformations, the articles of incorporation for Hartwell Property Group, the signature on the Nevada registration that I had matched with the help of the document examiner to Ruth Ann's handwriting on a form she'd filed locally. I built the case the way I build every case, methodically, without emotion, one document at a time, and I waited. She made the first move in February. I got a letter from her attorney, a firm downtown, expensive letterhead, informing me that Ruth Ann intended to contest my claim to any portion of my father's estate on the grounds that I had demonstrated in the months since his death, a pattern of erratic and unstable behavior that called my capacity into question. I read the letter twice. Then I set it down on my kitchen counter and made coffee. Erratic and unstable. I turned the words over in my mind. I thought about every interaction I'd had with Ruth Ann since my father's death. I had been polite, reserved. I had asked one question about one bank statement, and then I had left. I had not called. I had not shown up. I had not made a scene. She had, however, apparently been telling people things. A cousin of my father's called me that week, confused, apologetic, saying he'd heard I wasn't doing well, that I was having some kind of breakdown, that Ruth Ann was very worried about me. Then came the letter from the doctor. I didn't know the man. I had never met him, never been his patient, never spoken to him on the phone, but he had written, on official letterhead, a letter stating that based on information provided to him by my stepmother and her family, he had serious concerns about my psychological stability and my ability to make sound decisions regarding financial or legal matters. He had never examined me. He had never seen me. He had written a medical opinion about a patient he had never met. I took a photograph of that letter. I put it in a folder labeled Supporting Documents, Exhibit F, and I emailed Beverly. Her response came in 12 minutes. This is going to be very useful. The hearing was set for April. Ruth Ann's side had filed a petition to have the trust administrator replaced and to have her named as sole beneficiary on the grounds that I was incapacitated and had been making harassing and irrational demands of the estate. The harassing and irrational demands were, for the record, one phone call to the bank, one letter from Beverly requesting a formal accounting, and my presence at a meeting I had a legal right to attend. I wore a gray blazer. I had pressed it the night before and hung it on the back of my bathroom door. I ate breakfast. Oatmeal, because I'd read somewhere that your blood sugar affects how you carry yourself in high-stress situations, and I was not leaving anything to chance. I drove myself. I did not listen to music. I needed the quiet. Beverly met me outside the courthouse at 8:45. She looked at me and said, "How are you doing?" "I'm ready," I said. She nodded. She believed me. That meant something. Ruth Ann arrived with 2 people I didn't recognize. I assumed associates of her attorney and a woman I did recognize, a neighbor from my childhood street, someone who had known my father for years, who was apparently there to testify about my character, or rather, against it. I kept my face neutral. I sat down. I folded my hands. Her attorney opened by describing me as a young woman in grief who had unfortunately directed her pain outward, targeting her stepmother with a campaign of financial intimidation and harassment. He used words like fragile and obsessive. He said the toll on Ruth Ann had been significant. He said she had lost sleep. He said she was here today only because she was committed to honoring my father's true wishes, which had been to ensure that his wife was provided for. I wrote the word true in the margin of my notepad. Then I underlined it. Then Beverly stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform. She simply said, "Your Honor, my client is a licensed forensic accountant with 8 years of experience in financial investigation. She has prepared documentation which we believe demonstrates a pattern of unauthorized transfers from the decedent's trust account totaling approximately $361,000 over a 17-month period. We'd like to walk you through it." The judge looked up from his papers. He looked at Ruth Ann's attorney. He looked at Beverly. He said, "I'd like to see that documentation." Beverly submitted the binders, 43 pages, tabbed and indexed, with a 1-page executive summary at the front, because Beverly knows that judges, like everyone else, appreciate not having to work harder than necessary to understand what they're looking at. Ruth Ann's attorney objected. The judge overruled him before he'd finished the sentence. I watched the judge read. He turned pages slowly. He went back once, to page 11, I think, which was the section on Hartwell Property Group. He read that page twice. Then he took off his glasses. He set them on the desk in front of him. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. He looked at Ruth Ann, and he said, "Ma'am, I'd like to give you an opportunity to explain the transfers to Hartwell Property Group LLC before I ask anything else." The room was very quiet. Ruth Ann's attorney started to stand. The judge held up one hand. "I'm asking your client," he said. Ruth Ann opened her mouth, closed it, looked at her attorney, looked at the binder, looked at me, just for a second, the fastest glance, and then looked back at the judge. She said, "I'm not sure what you're referring to." The judge picked up his glasses, put them back on, and turned to page 11 again. 52 individual wire transfers, he said, over a period of 14 months, totaling $214,000 to a Nevada LLC with no documented business purpose and no evidence of any service rendered to the decedent or the trust. The registered agent address corresponds to a mailbox rental facility. He paused. "Are you saying you don't recognize this entity?" Ruth Ann looked at her attorney. Her attorney looked at the binder. Neither of them said anything. Beverly slid a second document across the table. She had timed it perfectly. She's done this long enough to know exactly when to move. "Your Honor," she said, "we'd also like to enter into evidence a comparison of the signature on the Nevada LLC registration against a notarized document signed by the respondent in 2021. We retained a certified document examiner who has provided a written opinion. The signatures are consistent." The judge looked at the document. He looked at the document. He looked at the document again. Then he turned to her attorney and said, very calmly, "Counsel, I'd strongly recommend a brief recess so you can advise your client." We took 20 minutes. I sat in the hallway on a wooden bench and drank water from a bottle Beverly had put in her bag that morning. She sat next to me and didn't say anything for a while, which I appreciated. There's a specific kind of silence that means you're doing fine. Keep going, and Beverly is very good at producing it. "The doctor's letter," I said after a few minutes. "We're getting there," she said. "I want it on the record." "It will be," she said. "I promise." When we went back in, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Ruth Ann's attorney spoke less. Ruth Ann herself had stopped crying. She sat very straight and stared at the surface of the table in front of her with an expression I recognized from my work, the look of someone who has just understood that the version of events they plan to tell is no longer available to them. Beverly addressed the doctor's letter directly. She explained the timeline. The letter had been written before I had filed any legal claims, at a point when my only documented communication with the estate had been a single inquiry to the bank. She noted that the physician had never examined me, had never treated me, and had acknowledged in a follow-up correspondence, which she submitted, that his letter had been based solely on secondhand information provided by Ruth Ann. "The purpose of this letter," Beverly said, "appears to have been to preemptively establish a narrative of incapacity in anticipation of the financial discrepancies being discovered." She didn't editorialize beyond that. She didn't need to. The judge asked Ruth Ann's attorney if he wished to respond. He said he would need additional time to review the evidence. The judge said that was understandable, and then he said something I had not expected. He said, "I'm also going to refer this matter to the licensing board." A physician who issues written medical opinions about individuals he has never examined raises serious ethical and potentially legal concerns that fall outside the scope of this hearing, but should not go unaddressed. He wrote something down. He looked at me, not unkindly, and said, "Your claim to the trust assets appears well documented and legally sound. I'm ordering a full forensic audit of the trust account to be conducted by an independent party." He glanced at Beverly. "Given your client's professional background, I assume you have no objection to that process." Beverly said, "None whatsoever, Your Honor." The audit took 3 months. I was not involved. I had to recuse myself from that part because of my professional relationship to the case, which I understood and accepted. I went back to work. I took on 2 new clients. I slept better than I had in over a year, which surprised me because nothing was resolved yet. But something in my body had apparently decided that the worst was behind us. It was. The audit confirmed $361,000 in unauthorized transfers. The Hartwell Property Group account was traced to a personal account held jointly by Ruth Ann and a man I had never heard of, who turned out to be someone she'd known before she married my father. The credit union account 2 hours away had been opened 8 months before my father's diagnosis. Ruth Ann's attorney negotiated a settlement. She agreed to repay the full amount, structured over 5 years, and to relinquish any further claims against the trust. She kept the house, which was in joint names and which Beverly had advised me would be difficult to contest without a longer, more expensive fight. I accepted that. Some things you decide are not worth the years they would cost you. The physician's letter was referred to the state medical board. I don't know what became of that process. I was told it could take some time. I hope it took some of his license too. But that part wasn't mine to control. A few weeks after the settlement was signed, I drove to the cemetery. My father is buried next to my mother, which was something he arranged himself years ago, before he got sick. In that quiet way he had of handling things he didn't want to make a fuss about. I brought coffee. One for me. One I set on the ground between the 2 headstones, which I know was not rational, but which felt right. I sat there for a while. The morning was cold in the way that April still can be. That particular cold that's losing its confidence, where you can feel it considering giving up. I thought about the scratch on the table in the courtroom. I thought about the stack of 43 pages in Beverly's binder. I thought about the 17 months of documents I had assembled one at a time, in the evenings, after work, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop and a legal pad, building something solid out of something that had been taken. My father had written down the account number and made me photograph the trust documents because he knew, I think, that he wouldn't always be there to explain things. He'd wanted me to have a record. He'd wanted me to be able to find my way back to what was mine. I did, Dad. It took a while, but I found it. I drove home in the early afternoon, and the sun was out by then, and the cold had done exactly what I'd expected and given up entirely. I opened the windows in my apartment for the first time since October. I made a cup of tea. I actually tasted, instead of just swallowed. I sat down at my kitchen table, which had no scratches in it, and I just sat there for a long time in my own quiet life. That was enough. That was enough. I've thought a lot about what made the difference. Not just in the hearing room, not just in the outcome, but in me. What kept me from falling apart during those 14 months when I had every reason to? And I keep coming back to something that isn't dramatic at all. It's just this. I didn't let my anger make my decisions for me. When I found that bank statement on the floor of my father's office, I wanted to confront Ruth Ann immediately. I wanted to walk into that kitchen and say every true thing I knew. I had the facts. I had the account number. I had the photograph my father had made me take. And I had the specific, hollow fury of someone who has just realized they were underestimated by someone who was supposed to be family. I didn't do it. Not because I was patient by nature. I'm not, particularly. But because something in my training kicked in before my emotions could. You don't present evidence before you have all of it. You don't show your hand to the person you're investigating. You document first. You feel later. That discipline, the kind you build through years of doing hard, careful work, turned out to be the only thing that mattered. Beverly could argue my case brilliantly, and she did. But she could only argue what I gave her. And what I gave her was 43 pages of documented truth that no one could explain away, no matter how expensive their attorney was. I think about Ruth Ann sometimes, not with hatred. That feeling burned off a long time ago, somewhere around month 3 of building the case, when I was too tired and too focused to maintain it. What I think about is the choice she made when she opened that first account. She made a decision that assumed no one was looking. That assumed the person most affected didn't have the tools or the will to look back. That assumption was the beginning of her unraveling, not mine. There's something I want to say to anyone who's been in a position like this. Not necessarily fraud, not necessarily a courtroom, but that specific experience of being dismissed, of being called unstable or irrational or too emotional, usually by the very person who gave you every reason to feel what you're feeling. It is one of the cruelest things one person can do to another. It takes your legitimate pain and turns it into evidence against you. The answer to it? The only real answer is to become undeniable. Not louder, not angrier, undeniable. You document, you organize, you find the Beverly Okafors of the world and you trust them with what you've built. And then you sit down in a room with a scratch on the table and you wait, and you let the truth do what truth does when it's given enough time and enough space. My father wrote down an account number and made me take a photograph because he believed that someday I might need it. He was right, but what he couldn't have known, what I didn't know about myself until it was tested, was that when that moment came, I would have exactly the skills and the steadiness to use it. That's the thing about the hard years of building a life. You don't always know what you're building it for until you do.